his original synthesis of ideas about existentialism, about God, about life. He is presently working on a book on this topic, working hard in his little study. And although he is not a book writer by trade, he's a lawyer. He's educated in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And he's going to speak to you hopefully for 40 minutes or so. And you can ask him some questions. So for many of you, this is your introduction to existentialism. And so he will introduce it to you, but he's also going to take you deeper. So please welcome Mr. Stephan Grozinger.
Thanks, that was very, very kind. When people think of existentialism, they're usually thinking about atheistic existentialism, which is the branch of existentialism that starts with the premise that God doesn't exist. And from what Bill tells me, most of you have read Existentialism is a Humanism, which is clearly from the atheistic existentialist point of view. Some of you may have read No Exit during French class, and I guess all of you will be reading it at some point. It's also an atheistic existentialist work. They tend to be, I think, kind of glum. They seem a little antisocial. They certainly seem a little pessimistic as you're reading them. And frankly, I think that's probably a valid assessment. I think atheistic existentialists would say that in fact they are a little pessimistic and a little antisocial. But we're going to be talking about atheistic existentialism today, but focusing on the opposite, theistic existentialism, which is existentialism from the point of view of a believer in God. So they have certainly common characteristics, but in many ways, theistic existentialism is the complete opposite of the words I just used to describe atheistic existentialism. It tends to be very warm, very focused on relational things, our relationship to each other, to God, and to the world. And obviously, rather than not believing in God, God is central to a theistic existentialism. For me, as Bill hinted, this is not an academic exercise. It's not something that I do because I think it's philosophically interesting. I think of myself as a devout Catholic. I hope I can say that fairly. And I'm very interested in understanding God and God's relationship to us. So that's how I come at this subject matter. For me, theistic existentialism, and the reason why I'm interested in writing a book on this matter, is probably the most accurate description of our relationship to God. I think our popular culture view of our relationship to God right now, that He commands us to be good and to be charitable and rewards us either in this life or then the next life, is probably a distraction of our true relationship with God, and I think is probably responsible for why faith seems to be deteriorating in the modern era and why we seem to be moving more and more into a secular culture. And I think that's because our popular view of God, this commanding and rewarding God, just doesn't really comport with how we instinctually think about God. So, I'm sorry.
A little bit of an effort.
Louder?
I can hear you pretty well, but just try, so we don't have the microphone. Try your best a little bit louder.
Will do. So I want to just run through the outline of what I plan to do this morning. We're going to talk about recurring themes in existentialism, both branches of existentialism, the basics of existentialism, again, both branches, atheistic and theistic. And then we're going to talk about three philosophers who are associated with existentialism. Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. He's considered the father of existentialism. Martin Buber, as Bill described earlier, who's by far my favorite philosopher, and I think the quintessential theistic existentialist. And Abraham Joshua Heschel. He doesn't make everybody's list as being an existentialist, but I think he's useful to this discussion. And then finally, I'm going to offer an independent exercise for you guys to do, if you like, after school at some point, and use that kind of as a synthesis of everything I'm going to say. This is a quote: "Your identity is not equivalent to your biography." I heard this on Krista Tippett's radio program on Being. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it.
Yeah.
And John O'Donohue is a former priest. He left the priesthood and became a poet for a while, shortly after this interview with Krista Tippett died. This is something, he never said in this interview that he was an existentialist, but it was very, very clear from what he was saying that in fact he is. And this quote in particular, I think, very much captures the idea of existentialism. So if somebody were to ask you to introduce yourself at a party or in a social gathering, you might describe yourself starting with your name, and then you might say what job you do or what school you attend, what your interests and hobbies are, and maybe your political views. That's a pretty popular one nowadays. But existentialism would say that's fine. That's obviously how we all introduce ourselves. But that's not really who you are. You're not really reducible to those things. When you're talking like that, you're telling people your biography, but you're not really drilling down into who you are as a person, your existence, the fact of your existence. And on a practical note, I had an experience just a few weeks ago. I wasn't on Facebook until about 2 months ago, and I've been making connections with all these people from high school, which for me was about 25 years ago. And some of these people have faded into the margins of my memory. I hardly remember who they are or who they were. And I got a message from one of these guys from high school, and he said to me, "Well, I knew you in high school. Who are you now?" And I kind of felt, if somebody's got to message you, you want to respond. So my hands hovered over the keyboard to respond to this guy for what must have been 10 minutes, trying to think, how do I describe who I am now? And I ultimately gave up. I ultimately didn't even try, because it's such a impossible exercise to essentially describe. Now again, I could say what my name is. You know my name. I could tell them what my job is, but I could never really drill down to who I am. And that's kind of the existentialist point. And you're probably kind of in the middle of the same exercise as you apply to colleges. Colleges are trying to judge you and evaluate you and identify you in terms of your GPA and your SATs, your activities, and what you wrote in your essay and how you wrote it. And colleges may think and they may tell you that they're drilling down to who you really are, but in fact, we all know that they're really not. And they're capturing one little narrow sliver of you. So the next slide, the next slide is a quote from an atheistic existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, who says, "Existence precedes essence." And this is whenever you hear the term existentialism, you'll almost certainly within the next 5 minutes hear these words. And frankly, I find them a little confusing, so I juxtaposed them against John O'Donohue's quote so you can see the similarities. Essentially what this means is that your existence, your identity, your very fact of your being is not your biography, your essence, the things that are your essential characteristics. Those two things are very different. So really these two quotes are synonymous with one another. So the domesticated version of existentialism invites you to reject the idea that you're defined by your job or the school you go to or your GPA or your interests. That's very, very simple, obviously very colloquial. I mean, when I'm at a party or at a social engagement and I introduce myself as a lawyer, instantly people glaze over and they figure they know exactly who I am and what my values are. We have to run through all their favorite lawyer jokes and that sort of thing. Also, same, and I'm sure you have this experience too, if you introduce yourself as a Catholic, especially in a non-Catholic crowd, you get that glaze over and they assume that they know your entire value system, all your positions on various things. That existentialism on the most colloquial, on the most domestic version says, don't do that. That's not accurate. When you pigeonhole somebody like that, you're missing the greater equation. On the more transformative version of existentialism, it invites you to reject the idea that you're identified by your morality, whether you're a good or bad person. And when you start thinking about it, you realize just how much human interaction is moral judgment and how much energy we put into putting people on a moral spectrum and how reflexive and compulsive that is. As soon as we meet somebody, we decide whether we like them on the basis of, well, do they seem like a good person to me? Do they seem like an honest person to me? And we tend to pigeonhole them, and for time immemorial, if we've decided they're bad, we put them in the bad category and we leave them there. Existentialism on a transformative level, and maybe this is what Jesus Christ was talking about in terms of forgiveness, is saying don't pigeonhole people on a moral level either. Another recurring theme in existentialism, one you'll hear very often as you study it, is you are radically free. You're not bound by dogma. You're not bound by church authority. You're not bound by cultural or moral codes. You have total and absolute freedom to follow your own conscience. For atheistic existentialists, they say that because God doesn't exist, there's no God to command you. And that may seem relatively benign, but keep in mind that back in the 1940s, when most of these guys were writing 1930s, 1940s, certainly atheism existed, but it had never really been a movement the way it became with these guys, Jean-Paul Sartre and the others. So it was a kind of a groundbreaking thing to tell people in the 1930s and 1940s, well, there is no God, and therefore you're not commanded to be good the way the church is telling you to be good. For theistic existentialists, obviously they come at it from an entirely different angle, and they say there is a God, but that God is not interested in commanding you. That is not your relationship with God. And that brings us to our next slide and really the next concept. And I've put the first 3 lines together for you to kind of tie them together. We talked about your identity is not the equivalent of your biography from John O'Donohue. Existence precedes essence, being essentially the same quote. Now what I'm adding are my own words. God is not what he can do for you, and you are not what you can do for God. That's the basic theistic existentialist perspective, is that we should not define our relationship with God in terms of utility, in terms of what you do for him and what he does for you. We often define God by roles, especially moral roles like our judge and the forgiver of sins, the guy who's going to get us into heaven. And we often define our relationship to God in terms of our roles to him, that we're supposed to be good, that we're supposed to give to charity, and we're supposed to go and worship God every Sunday. Existentialism says those roles don't define the relationship, and really goes back to the idea of God as father, as parent. And kind of as an exercise, you might ask, if somebody asked you who your parents are, would you respond by telling them what you do for them or what they do for you, or is it a much deeper relationship? And that's what theistic existentialists say about God. Are you always going to talk about God and define God in terms of what you're supposed to be doing and what God is supposed to be doing to you or for you? And when you're praying, are you always asking for God, asking God for something, or are you expecting God to command you in that prayer? Or is it a more direct relationship, a less purposeful relationship? And then at the bottom of the slide is another recurring theme, obviously just for theistic existentialists. Trust your own experience of God over anyone else's. So theistic existentialists encourage us to seek out our own experience of God. Don't just regurgitate dogma. And you know, as most of us here I think are Catholics, we love dogma. If you mention the word baptism to a room full of Catholics, they'll talk for half an hour or an hour about what baptism is, when it's proper, when it's improper, who can be baptized, who can't be baptized. But if you ask them to drill down and really say, what does that sacrament mean, you're usually met with more silence or more dogma. Theistic existentialism asks you to look at those concepts far more directly, far more personally. And they say if you have an authentic God experience, don't let any institution dissuade you. I always think about St. Paul on the road to Damascus. He has this incredible vision of Jesus, the risen Jesus. He leaves for Arabia for a number of months or years. He comes back. Ultimately, he's called to Jerusalem to be confronted by Peter, and they talk. And Peter essentially is trying to tell him to cool it. You know, talk to only the Israelites. Don't go out to the Gentiles. And Paul essentially says, and he wins this argument, he essentially says, no, I'm going out to the Gentiles. This is what I was told to do in my authentic God experience. And nobody on earth, even you, Peter, is going to tell me otherwise. That's kind of a classic theistic existentialist perspective. So the question again, another recurring theme is, what guides you? If you're radically free, as we talked about before, what should be guiding you? For the atheistic existentialist, just your own radically free conscience. And I think you guys have just read existentialism is a humanism. That kind of tries to answer that question. It says, yes, there's this element of despair, but through that you have to get through it and be guided by your radically free conscience. It's not really explained all that well, and I'm not sure it can be successfully explained, but that's kind of maybe the portion of the absurdity of atheistic existentialism. For theistic existentialists, they don't really care or care to comment on what should be guiding you, but they reject that dogma should be guiding you. They reject that a church institution should be guiding you. They think you should be guided by your own personal experience of God, like St. Paul. Both atheistic and theistic existentialists reject the idea that God gives them commands to be followed, like universal laws. Obviously, atheistic existentialism rejects that because they believe there is no God in the first place, so how could he possibly be commanding anyone? And they also reject things like social codes and things like that. They would say that those come from nothing, and you can ignore them. Theistic existentialism rejects that idea because they believe every individual is capable of having a direct experience of God without any intermediaries, no priests or ministers or rabbis or church authorities. And because those experiences of God are fundamentally private and extremely personal, between you and God, eyeball to eyeball, they can't, by definition, include commands for everyone to follow. In fact, most existentialists agree that God does not command anything in the usual sense. I'm going to run relatively quickly, rapidly, through some common characteristics of existentialism, both atheistic and theistic. But to start with, to kind of preamble, pinning down existentialists is a little bit like nailing Jello to a wall. Almost by definition, they don't conform to any uniform definition, and nothing that I'm going to say about any one of them is going to be true for all of them. The first common characteristic is proof. Existentialists of both branches just aren't interested in proving anything to you. For theistic existentialists, belief in God is the starting point, and it's the foundation of the rest of their thought. They don't present any argument. They're not interested in proving God's existence to you. They figure if you've had a direct experience of God, you know God exists. Correspondingly, atheistic existentialists don't believe in God. They don't present any argument to support that, and their primary aim is trying to re-anchor you and your identity in a world where there is no God. The second common characteristic, no institutional systems. Fundamentally, both branches of existentialism believe each individual stands alone as a separate unit. There's this kind of lonesomeness in the philosophy. They're looking for meaning for the individual, not social norms, not group meaning, or universal values or moral codes that everybody should follow. Just the individual unit acting and living and finding meaning on their own. Absurdity is a word that you often hear associated with existentialism. It's mostly an issue for atheistic existentialists. The absurdity of existence unanchored from the usual source of meaning, namely God. How do you find meaning as a finite creature, somebody who's going to die, fundamentally alone, not loved by God and not really understood by anybody else in the real sense of things? For theistic existentialism, absurdity comes from being unanchored to the most common accepted concepts of God, because they reject that popular notion that God expects you to be good and is commanding you and has a plan for your life. For both atheistic and theistic existentialists, there's absurdity in recognizing that you're not bound by any moral code or God command. Anxiety is very much related to that. Existentialists expect you to feel anxiety as you realize the absurdity of your position. For atheistic existentialists, maybe that anxiety never really abates. You're fundamentally alone, you're going to die, and you will need to find meaning in that status. For theistic existentialists, it's more of a temporary condition that you emerge from when you realize your true relationship to God and become comfortable with it. He's not commanding you to do anything. He has no goals for you. He's not particularly concerned with whether you're good or bad. He forgives every transgression before it happens, whether you're sorry for it or not. And God is not going to use you as a means to an end. And that's really a gospel of unconditional love and total forgiveness. But most people are anxious about it, maybe even a little angry about it. They're concerned that without a divinely commanded moral code, they'll be bad, or the people around them will be bad. They'll stop giving to charity, that sort of thing. which is obviously a problem for people who see religion as a mechanism for social control. Theistic existentialism essentially blows that right out of the water. A search for meaning. In the face of absurdity and anxiety, existentialists search for meaning, a place in the world for the individual. For theistic existentialists, like I've said before, God provides that meaning. Atheistic existentialists have a harder job finding meaning within the individual without any reference to anything outside. Not friends, not family, not culture, not God. Relationship with God, and obviously this is focused on theistic existentialists only. The individual strives to achieve a direct, personal, radically free, and private relationship or communion with God. No intermediaries, and no formula for achieving it. Most importantly, existentialists seek God to understand their place in the universe, and not because they think it's commanded to do that, or to receive universal moral commands. Overall, this is very important, existentialists trust their own experience of God over any institutional experience. So now I'd like to talk to you about a couple of the philosophers that are associated with existentialism, theistic existentialism primarily. This is Søren Kierkegaard, who was born in 1813, died very young at 1855 in Denmark. His hallmark book on existentialism is called Fear and Trembling. And he's considered the father of existentialism, both branches of existentialism, although he was certainly a theist. He lived at a time when Christianity was virtually the national religion of Denmark. To be a Christian in Denmark came to mean being a nice person, living respectfully, doing the things that are expected of them, and to be Danish and well-behaved was enough to be considered a Christian in Kierkegaard's time, and nobody would have argued with you. Which, of course, is not unique to Denmark in the 1800s. A lot of people say today that they're religious because they are nice to others and give to charity, and therefore consider themselves spiritual. Kierkegaard would turn over in his grave if you heard anybody say that. Kierkegaard believed that true faith should mean being prepared to violate what the rest of society says is good in response to your personal relationship with God. And to illustrate that, Kierkegaard spent nearly the entire book, Fear and Trembling, studying Genesis 22, which is the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And just as a review, God demands that Abraham sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham agrees and starts the 3-day journey to Moriah to do that sacrifice, never telling his wife or his servants or his son what he's about to do. But as Abraham reaches for the knife, God tells him to stop. Kierkegaard points out that Abraham's decision to do what God told him to do is absurd. It's not based on any recognizable moral code. It's murder, essentially. If he told his wife, Sarah, or the local authorities, or his son what he was going to do, obviously there would have been trouble for Abraham. But Abraham does it because he trusts his experience of God over those social norms and over the institutional expectation. Read literally, obviously, the story is a little disturbing, a father sacrificing his son at God's command, but the point is not what God asked Abraham to do. The task was designed to be outrageous and to offend our moral expectations, and the author could have chosen any other morally outrageous task. The point is that Abraham trusted his personal experience of God and followed through on it, right or wrong. Kierkegaard believes each one of us is called to that sort of transformative relationship to God. We're called to be what Kierkegaard called a single one, or an authentic self, and we'll hear that term again, which can only be accomplished by relating to God as individuals, not as a group of Catholics or a group of Christians or a group of Jews or Muslims, but as our own individual selves. What's interesting to me about this story, among other things, is just how important it is to the three major religions. You'll recall that God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, but Sarah was too old to have children, so Abraham sleeps with his servant, I believe, Hagar, and they have Ishmael. Then after Abraham's encounter with God, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. Sarah decides that she's not too happy about having Hagar around anymore, so they're banished into the desert. Ishmael becomes the descendant of Muhammad, who's the precursor of Islam. And obviously, Abraham is considered father of Judaism, And meanwhile, Isaac is the descendant of Jacob, David, Joseph, and finally Jesus, and so is the founder of Christianity. So here at the root of three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is his manifesto to radical freedom of conscience. Existentialism is the foundation, essentially, of those three religions. So the next philosopher I'd like to talk about is Martin Buber. He was born in Vienna and was educated there and in Berlin, and he left for Palestine, which is now Israel, just ahead of the Holocaust. And this is, you'll notice that most of these guys are writing and talking in the 1930s and 1940s. And the theory is that existentialism arose and is at its most prominent during times of tremendous social strife when people start really questioning the fabric of society. Martin Buber wrote a book called, in German, Ich und Du, which is translated in English usually to I and Thou. Buber believes that real life is meeting, and that's probably a bad translation. The German word is Zwischenmenschlichkeit. So rather than meeting, it's probably closer to communion. And contrast this, you guys are going to be reading or have read No Exit, which is the atheistic existentialist book, where a group of people die and go to hell, and hell for the author is, I don't know what it is, 5 or 6 people who are condemned to live in a room together. They have no eyelids, so they can never sleep or close their eyes, and they always have to interact with these people, and all of them are fairly unpleasant people. And he says that hell is other people, is the famous quote from that book. Contrast that to Buber, who says real life is communion. They're almost direct opposites of each other. Buber makes a distinction between two basic types of relationship or communion that people are capable of: the I-it relationship and the I-thou relationship. In the I-it relationship, you, the I, is a thinking, feeling, sentient person, and the it is an object, either an actual object, like a chair, or a person you're treating as an object. And Buber isn't saying that we shouldn't treat people as objects. We do. If you're taking a cab across town, the person who's driving the cab is an object to you. It's a purely business relationship. In the I-thou relationship, however, it's virtually mystical for Buber. You're drawn into relationship with the other. You don't experience the other. You can't describe the other. You can't use those words like on Facebook to describe the other. You can only, what he calls, actualize the other. And you are both made radiant in the splendor of the confrontation, as Buber says. The I-thou encounter can occur between you and another person, like a friend or a family member or a stranger. A thing, like a tree or a flower or a stone. But Buber says it's best actualized between yourself and God. Now, this is obviously kind of mystical language, and I found a quote in a book by, should have been showing you that slide. Those are the three things we just talked about. In a book by Rabbi Neil Gilman, he was using this to describe something else, but I think it's the perfect description of the I-thou encounter, and I'd like to read it with you now. Can you see that okay? Yeah.
By the way, Stephan,
Yeah.
We've done this quote in the past, and we sometimes wonder what an enemy is.
Right, yeah, so did I.
So what-
It's not the sea creature, it's a flower. It's a kind of a fall blooming, very pretty flower. In fact, I planted some in my garden just because I like this so much. It's quite nice. Anyway, I look at the anemone. I look at a flower. And notice that at first the author is talking about this anemone in terms of utility, in terms of function, in terms of what existentialists would call essence. The artist in me sees the play of line and color, shape and form. The botanist in me sees a field of research, an opportunity to acquire knowledge of how this flower came to be what it is. The merchant in me sees a way of marketing it. The aesthete in me sees it as matching the color scheme of my living room. So right now, this flower is just what purpose it holds for the author. Now we move into the I-thou relationship. But the believer in me sees an infinitely more primitive dimension of the anemone. What cried for recognition here is the simple anemone itself, the fact that it is there in the first place. There's that concept of existence preceding the characteristics of the anemone. The inherent mystery of its very being and my intrinsic inability to account for the fact that there are facts in the first place. I am then thrown back to a much more primitive level of awareness, a level that is pre-conceptual, that precedes my ability to think or say anything else about the flower or any aspect of my experience. Again, this inability to put into words what the anemone is. What I see is the anemone, but I see it as transfigured, as calling attention to a dimension of reality beyond itself. That transcendent dimension of a world is infused with God's presence, one manifestation of the divine pathos. It is the world as embodying God's cry for attention. And as you look at that, think about what the I-thou encounter really is. In some ways, it's a sense of wonder. It's a sense of awe. The I-thou encounter is the only place where you can realize your full potential, according to Buber. It's in relationships or ways of meeting or communion where your authentic personality is revealed. Remember, again, Kierkegaard's concept of the authentic self. Now, I think my own theory is that the Bible records a series of I-thou encounters, and I've listed some of them here. Obviously, we've talked about Abraham encountering God on Mount Moriah. Moses on Sinai is the most important I-thou encounter of the Jewish faith. The prophets. We have this tradition in Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, of inspired scripture, but we don't often think about where that inspiration came from, what that inspiration looked like. Was Jeremiah sitting around in his living room, then one day God came in the front door and started dictating the Bible to him? Or was it more of a nonverbal I-thou encounter where Jeremiah was inspired to write the words that he wrote? St. Paul on the road to Damascus, probably the most celebrated I-thou encounter in Christianity. Paul on his way to execute warrants on Christians in Damascus has this partially verbal but largely non-verbal encounter with the risen Jesus, and his life turns around and he becomes the quintessential author of Christian texts. The baptism of Jesus, again, this non-verbal connection between Jesus and the Holy Spirit. They say it descends like a dove from the sky, the heavens are rent open, and the primary message is, this is my son, kind of the Paul Tillich, you are accepted, you are acceptable by the universe. Pentecost, obviously, again, an I-thou encounter between God and the apostles, the road to Emmaus, and then also, from a Buddhist perspective, perhaps Buddha under the Bodhi tree as an I-thou encounter. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the common characteristics of an I-thou encounter, and I've hinted at some of them. The I-thou encounter is intensely personal. Each participant is absolutely irreplaceable to that relationship. So if you and I are having an I-thou encounter, this mystical encounter, and I leave the room, you can't pick it up with somebody else and continue the same encounter. It changes both parties. And that's a little bit shocking because we think of this I-thou encounter with God, and how are we, human beings, changing God? And I would suggest to you that, in fact, there are moments in the Bible where it appears the human being is changing God. You have Abraham bargaining with God at the gates of Sodom, and you have Moses bargaining with God at the foot of Sinai. Buber says you can't verbalize the I-thou. Trying to communicate it always corrupts the message. The Bible is the best effort to record the I-thou relationship between God and the prophets and other authors of Scripture, but it's always corrupted because they're verbalizing a nonverbal encounter. So that kind of would put a literal interpretation of the Bible on its head, because Buber is essentially saying this can't be a literal interpretation. This is taking the nonverbal and making it verbal. And very important, and this is the big one for me, Buber says the I-thou encounter can never be legislative. No moral command, no moral code or command can be communicated by the I-thou encounter. He would be very suspicious of the Ten Commandments, the story of the Ten Commandments, and he would say that they were probably a very badly corrupted recordation of an I-thou encounter. Now, obviously, Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments are a very important part of Jewish faith, a very important part of our faith as well. And we focus on the commandments being written on the stone tablets and Moses coming down and seeing the golden calf and all that part of the story. What we don't usually focus on are the other elements of the story. Moses coming down from the mountain and his face is shining, so much so that the people, the Israelites, have to put a veil over his face to protect themselves from this glow that comes from Moses. And that, I would say, is probably an indication that what they're really talking about is this I-thou encounter. And then it seems like Jesus, when he essentially replaces the Ten Commandments by saying love one another, it seems almost like Jesus is agreeing with Buber that the commands from God must be a corruption of the real message. And the real message is not a command at all, but a description of divine love and human love. Finally, Buber says that you can't live in the I-thou. You have to return to the I-it world and live there. And I have to take two takeaways from that statement. The first is that it takes the pressure off. A transformation is never complete or permanent. And although it's good to be there, to use words from the Transfiguration, we do have to come down from the mountain. An encounter with God does not necessarily make you a good person. Bill and I are in a group that discusses scripture from time to time. We're talking about Jacob right now. And what's interesting about the story of Jacob is that Jacob is a jerk. And then he has this encounter with God, but he remains a jerk several times throughout the story. So it's almost this acceptance of the fact that just encountering God does not make you a moral person. As Catholics, we have this concept that you encounter God, you grow the halo, you become saintly, you never do another bad thing in your life. Buber would say that's not how it works. And then the other takeaway from the idea that you can't live in the I-thou is that it lends support to the idea that although God may be present everywhere, he reveals himself in discrete moments in time, and which I think supports the idea of Catholic sacrament, acknowledging that God's presence is not discernible at the same level at all times, but that sometimes he bends a little closer to the earth, which is, I think, where the concept of a tabernacle comes from, both in Judaism and in Christianity. Now, the next philosopher I'd like to talk about is Abraham Joshua Heschel. And again, he's not necessarily an existentialist in everybody's book, but I think he has some value to us here today. He was born in Warsaw and educated in Berlin and lived in Germany. He escaped just weeks before the Holocaust and lost several members of his family to it. He moved to New York in 1940 and lived there until his death, and he was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I mention him here because he kind of fleshes out theistic existentialism and suggests some of the mechanics of the I-thou encounter. Remember when we were doing the anemone piece, there was a kind of a sense of wonder, a sense of awe included in that. Abraham Heschel kind of clues into that. And one of the hallmarks of his writings is this radical amazement or wonder. He says it's very much like the I-thou encounter described by Buber. It's the primary way in which God speaks, through this amazement and wonder. He speaks to the prophets and other individuals in the Bible, and Heschel would say it's how God speaks to each one of us. I couldn't find an excerpt that would do it justice, but this next slide kind of distinguishes it from run-of-the-mill enjoyment. So the I-thou encounter as wonder and amazement and awe, but not just, wow, that's a nice flower. Wonder is not a sense of aesthetic enjoyment. Endless wonder is endless tension, a situation in which we are shocked at the inadequacy of our awe, at the weakness of our shock, as well as the state of being asked the ultimate question, kind of like spirituality drinking out of a fire hose. Endless wonder unlocks an innate sense of indebtedness. Within our awe, there is no place for self-assertion, the diminishment of the ego. Within our awe, we only know that all we own, we owe. Wonder is the state of our being asked. The ineffable is a question addressed to us. All that is left to us is a choice to answer or to refuse to answer. So, in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that you do a kind of independent exercise at some point outside of school. Find some place that you identify as your spiritual safe place or sanctuary. Maybe somewhere in the natural world, a beach or the woods or in your backyard. Go alone and try to be as quiet and calm, as centered as possible. And what I'd like you to do is prayerfully reflect on God from two perspectives. The first is to visualize or think about God looking at you. See God as looking at you without defining your characteristics or whether you're generally good or bad, and knowing that he's not going to judge you or send you on a mission or demand anything of you. This is kind of contemplative prayer. You hear about contemplative prayer being pushing all the thoughts out of your mind or trying to control the thoughts in your mind. This is gently pushing all the roles and characteristics of God and your relationship to God out of your mind, and knowing that that's the intimacy of how God sees you. Not a Facebook message on what your characteristics are, but something much deeper. And then visualize the opposite. Visualize or think about you looking at God, and think about what you see and how you define God. Don't define God as a judge or creator or planner or rewarder or punisher. Remember that you have a familial relationship with God, not a business relationship. You're not there to receive instructions or commands, to be evaluated or judged. God invites the metaphor of father and parent, and not the commanding, judgmental, correcting father, but a father who feels how vulnerable he is because he's chosen to have a child that's going to go out into the world. This, for me, is prayer. Not intercessory prayer, not confessional prayer, not worshiping prayer, not even gratitudinal prayer. It's just prayer. And in my opinion, you're now open to the I-thou encounter with God, transcending any goals or expectations of one another in an existentialist manner. Finally, just to review the goals of that exercise, you are trying to find your authentic self. You are your best self in the I-thou encounter with God. It's personal. Like Abraham, try to be open to everything and anything. It's nonverbal. You're not listening for a voice. There are no commands. You're not looking for guidance or rules or to solve any problems or to criticize culture or yourself. It's not permanent. You won't be growing a halo, and you aren't going to be acting differently. And remember, finally, the anemone. This is a positive, joyful, and mysterious and wondrous encounter. Thank you.
We have about 7-8 minutes for questions.
Okay, great. Please.
I know that you said that existentialists believe that there's no plan. Do they think also that God is not omniscient, the theistic?
That God is not on a mission?
Omniscient.
Oh, omniscient. No, I think they would say that he is omniscient. It's not something I think that would be in the forefront of existentialist thought, whether God is omniscient or not. But I think that they would probably say that if he knows the future, he's not telling you, and he's not trying to direct you into one future or another future. He's essentially letting the universe unfold in its own course. Yes, please.
If existentialists don't believe that God commands people, but they use Abraham and Isaac as an example of just finding a personal relationship with God, how do they justify God commanding Abraham to kill Isaac?
I think I think they're glossing that distinction. I think what they're saying is essentially that Abraham was able at that moment to refuse, or Abraham, since this is think about it as a nonverbal command. This isn't God walking into Abraham's living room and saying, okay, now you're going to kill Isaac, but more of a nonverbal command of Abraham saying, okay, now I feel like I have got to go and kill Isaac. So it was a command that clearly Abraham, if the existentialist thing works at all, Abraham was free to say, God, not today, not interested in doing that. That sounds crazy to me. Not sure you're even God, that sort of thing. What Kierkegaard is saying essentially is when Abraham thinks that he's understood the nature of God, he acts towards it. And again, it's not so much what the precise order was. It's really that it was a completely socially nuts order, and Abraham followed it anyway. Yes, please.
You were saying that the I-thou encounter changes both parties, and that God changes us in some way, but also that God has something to learn from us. But isn't it almost hubristic to think that we have something to teach God?
Yes, and I'm not sure that they would say that they're trying to teach God anything. I think what they're saying is that God allows himself to be changed. I mean, and again, from a literal perspective, when Abraham is standing in front of Sodom and he says, would you spare Sodom if there were 10 just people? And God says, well, okay, yeah, 10 just people I would. And then he says, how about 7? And God says, well, yeah, sure, 7 I would. In a way, from the literal perspective, it makes God seem kind of silly. God is being reminded of something that he already knows. But I think the basic message is that we can interact with God, and although God may be omniscient, God still allows us to change him in some way. Yes, please.
Do existentialists believe in like the fact that we should follow civic code and codes that are like set by the government? Because if we do, like a lot more dangerous.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, they do. What they're essentially trying to say is that you have to make, you individually have to make the decision as to whether you're going to follow those codes, and you have to individually decide why you're going to do that. They kind of, so they say essentially don't knee-jerk reaction say, okay, because the government has told me I can't go over 25 on this road, that I'm not going to go over 25 on this road. Think about why you're following that rule. It may be because going over 25 is dangerous and you accept that that's dangerous. It may be that you understand that if you go 25 on that particular road, everybody else is likely to go 25 on that particular road. That's a reason that you've come up with for yourself to follow those laws. And maybe it's blanket. I mean, maybe you say, I follow laws because society works out better that way, and I want to be part of that process, and I don't want to fight that process. So, in a way, from both branches, atheistic existentialism and theistic existentialism, they would both say there are reasons to go to church, but they have to be your reasons. You can't just be going to church because, well, this is what my family does and we've always done this, or a feeling that God commands me to go to church, but really drilling down and figuring out when you're sitting there, why am I here? Why do I choose to come here every week? Is it because I feel like I have to, or am I here for another reason? And I think existentialists would say that your obedience to those rules becomes much richer for you if you know why you're there and if it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. Yes?
You
Please.
said before that atheistic existentialists don't have or find it more challenging to find a source of meaning. What do they do if they don't have sort of a God they do to give out meaning for their lives?
Yeah, the question is, for atheistic existentialists, they find it difficult to find meaning for themselves without a God figure. And what do they finally do to find that meaning? And that's a great question. And I'm not sure that they come up with a compelling answer that I could express to you. It goes kind of back to that concept of absurdity and anxiety. I think there's a recognition that if you're just an individual and you're not going to find your meaning in your friends or your family or your culture or your religion or anything else, if it's just you, it's difficult to find meaning that way. It is somewhat anxiety-provoking and somewhat absurd. And I think that's the challenge of existentialism. It kind of puts you in that tension and never really pulls you back out. At least the atheistic existentialism does. Theistic existentialism obviously has a very different focus and doesn't have that problem. But yeah, you're right. I think, from my perspective anyway, there's a tension that is never fully resolved in that question. Yes?
Do existentialists believe that humans are fundamentally good, or is it not defined?
That's a great question. Do existentialists or theistic existentialists specifically, or both?
Both.
Both. Do both kinds of branches of existentialism believe that human beings are fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? I think the response would have to be that they don't believe either. Atheistic existentialists would say that there is no human nature. There is no human default position. You have to decide for yourself what you're going to do. Now, I mean, from my perspective, that strikes me as completely wrong. I think we all have to acknowledge on some level that there is human nature. I mean, we are, and there's nurture as well. We're all a combination of nature and nurture, and to say that that doesn't exist is probably wrong-headed to begin with. So I would say that atheistic existentialists would say there's no such thing, there's no answer to that question, you all have to decide for yourself. Theistic existentialism, I think, would fall more towards saying there is a human nature and it's a fundamentally good one because it's connected to the divine.
We are out of time. It's 9:30, so I would recommend this. Please write some of your questions down in the journal, whatever. These are just things we'll bounce back into existentialism, you can see the connections and threads that tie back into stuff we've discussed already a lot of times this year and your courses in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. So thank you to Mr. Grozinger